this week's episode. I think we're pretty much about done with getting the system operational. The whole front end is still assembled. Carburetor is on. I was able to get the new fuel line in. It uses a 3/8 bar fitting, but I also have another fuel line that uses an AN style. I also picked up a regulator, and the whole reason for the regulator is I'm going to start it up right now, and you guys are going to see what's going on. Alright, so I just started it up, and this is the problem that we're having. It started up pretty well, but if you guys look into the secondary side, you might be able to tell what's going on. We're actually getting a little bit of seepage. Up there it goes, it's flooding, and it's flooding because on the secondary side it's actually pulling fuel through the boosters. So the problem that I'm having is that as soon as I start this up, I get a bunch of flooding issues, and that's because the factory fuel pump is pushing through this adapter filter into this fuel rail, into these fuel bowls, but then there's nothing to regulate down the pressure. So whatever the pump is putting out, that's the pressure that's being applied into these bowls. Yesterday I was having issues with the rear side of the carburetor, and now this morning that I just started it up, I'm having issues with the front. So I went to my local auto parts store and I picked up some brass fittings along with the cheapy fuel pressure regulator. This is one that I use on all my cars. Part number is right here, and what it does, I'm going to actually drop it down to the lowest setting, which is 4.5 psi. I believe that's what they come calibrated at, is 4.5 psi. Once I get an actual gauge on here, I'm going to be able to dial it in, but I want to drop it as low as possible to prevent any kind of flooding, so I could have the car idle and start doing any kind of preliminary tuning with the basic fuel system that I have now. Later, I'm going to be upgrading to something a little bit more proper, but for right now, while I'm pushing everything along, I'm just going to use basic components that anybody can get, and then from there, we're going to move up. Alright, so I've got everything assembled. I don't have any hose clamps or anything. Everything's pretty low pressure, but I will have hose clamps before I get this on the road. As you guys can see, I have like tons of hose going all the way around everywhere. After I figure out where everything's going to be, I'm going to go ahead and trim everything down to better fit everything. My spark plug cables, as you guys can see, are just all coiled around. When my dad originally bought this set, he intentionally bought them too long so he can trim them down to make them work with whatever he decided to do, but he never got around to trimming them, and they've just been getting destroyed. So I'm going to clip them and put new ends on them as soon as I get a chance. But as for the fuel system, it seems to be holding pressure. I had a problem with the front needle and seat on this carburetor. This is the 750 vacuum secondary, the aluminum one that I was going to use originally, and then I tried switching over to the 600. That one didn't work, so I went back to the 750. I got myself a cheapy little regulator. I've got the needle and seat taken care of. Fuel pressure is where it's supposed to be. I've got the fuel in the bowls right below the center of the sight glass, so everything's all good there. Let's go ahead and hear this start. Alright, so I've had it idling probably for at least 10 minutes now. I went ahead and I set the idle on the carburetor, so that's all good to go. It's idling probably around 750, 800 RPMs right now. I busted out my timing gun and I hooked it up and I set it to 13 degrees. The engine actually wanted closer to like 18 to 20 degrees at idle, but because I haven't modified the distributor, if I do that when I'm out on the road and I have the vacuum advance, it's gonna push it out to like 40, 42 degrees, and I really don't want that. So I brought it down to about 13 degrees for right now. It starts up really well. It idles pretty nicely. It could idle better, but like I said, I will deal with the idle situation as I go along. I only have the water pump. I don't have a fan hooked up to it right now. It does seem to be getting up to temperature. It has not overheated at all just yet, but I have a feeling that if I let it idle for too long, it will end up overheating. But because the hood's up and I've got plenty of airflow because it's so windy today, I don't think the engine's gonna be overheating anytime soon, but it might if I leave it too long. So I will be getting the fan for it. I just haven't received it in the mail. I have the clutch fan sitting over there, but because I want an electric fan for this, I'm gonna have to wait a little bit. The only thing that's left now is to set up the linkage for this carburetor. It used to have a Holley carburetor, but the linkage was super stretched out. It was not reliable at all, so at this point, I do need to get that hooked up. So we've got some interesting news. As you guys can see, I've actually removed the carburetor, and that's because my dad just called me and he let me know that he found an edelbrock RPM intake that he picked up at the swap meet over the weekend, and I'm actually going to go right now to go pick it up. Once I have that in my possession, we're going to go ahead and look it over. So this is the intake in question. This is an edelbrock RPM intake. It's one of the newest intakes you can get for the big block Mopar. It's probably the best intake if you have the hood clearance, which I probably don't, but I'm going to make it work anyway. Significantly taller than the intake that I have on it now. The only caveat is that he got it super cheap, but the only caveat is that the reason he got it cheap is because this bolt hole right here in the front corner, this guy is stripped out. Something happened where they broke a bolt and they tried to get it out and they ended up making a big hole, and this hole is unusable. It's plugged, but it's unusable. So what I ended up doing is I pulled a spacer off of the Offenhauser intake and I've installed it on the edelbrock intake right here. I actually tried to drill through this hole and then install a plug and then a stud so I can use this intake the normal way, but I actually was not able to, unfortunately. So this is the best way that I can get it to run. I'm sure eventually I'll take it to a machine shop. They have much sharper drill bits than I do, and I actually broke a couple trying to get it out. So unfortunately, I'm just gonna have to run it like this. This is not the ideal spacer, but this is the spacer that I have now. I'm gonna go ahead and order the correct spacer, but I need the carburetor in the place that it's going to be. And the reason for that is the linkage for the accelerator and the kickdown are completely dependent on the position of the carburetor. So if the carburetor is gonna sit up higher, I'm gonna have to modify the linkage to suit wherever the carburetor is going to be. Because this is a 1-inch spacer, I'm going to order a 1-inch spacer that'll fit a square bore pattern that doesn't look all weird in the plenum area. Hopefully it'll help it flow a little bit better in the top end. Low RPM and idling, it'll probably have zero effect, but I'm sure where I'm going to start seeing disturbances and maybe even a little bit of disruption will be in the higher RPMs. For now, I'm not too worried about it. I just want to get it going. So the goal right now is to remove the Offenhauser intake, install the edelbrock intake, and then start getting the linkage lined up. Alright, so I've got both intakes here side by side. What I really love about the big block Mopars is that it's a completely dry intake, very similar to an LS. Aside from removing the carburetor and the fuel lines, you really don't need to mess with the cooling system or the distributor at all. So swapping intakes is a really fast process. I really like the way it's set up. That being said, look at these intakes. They couldn't be more different. If anything, if you were just glancing at them, you would almost assume that they were from completely different engines. Look how flat this is compared to the edelbrock RPM intake. Excluding the spacer that's up on top, the edelbrock beats the Offenhauser intake by a solid inch, and the runners on the edelbrock intake are perfectly designed so they have near equal length runners, which has been shown time and time again on the dyno to make a huge difference in power. We look at the Offenhauser intake, and the intake's pretty much divided in half. Half the intake feeds this, half the intake feeds that. I'd really like to dyno these back to back, but that'll have to be for another day. Right now I really want to get the linkage hooked up, so let's go ahead and install the RPM intake. So as you guys can see, it's actually running pretty good. I don't know if it's actually running better than with the other intake, but it's running fine. With this intake, I actually had to turn out the idle adjustment screws about 3/4 of a turn for it to even idle. I would give it a couple pumps and it would immediately turn off. The more pumps that I gave it, the longer it would stay on, but still it had trouble maintaining its speed. So what I did is I ended up going 3/4 of a turn out on each side, and I was getting it to idle. And now it idles pretty good, although the idle speed was now too high. So then I turned down the idle speed a little bit, and then I turned out the mixture screws another 1/4 turn. So now I'm at 1.5 turns out completely on both the left and the right side of the carburetor. So now it's time to actually modify the linkage so I can run this intake and carburetor with the stock linkage. So I'm finally going to bolt on the transmission, the kickdown, along with the accelerator cable onto the intake, and I'm going to see what we need to actually get it going. What I've got here is the stock bracket for a motorhome 440. It is exactly the same thing as what I have in the car right now. The only difference is that mine has a modified shift arm that my dad messed with a long time ago, and this one doesn't have the throttle cable attached. But the plan here is to actually reuse this section right here, trim this down, bend this at a 90, extend it about 3 inches that I need, and then on the other part on the engine that looks like this, give that piece of metal a bend, and then have it bolt on here. So it'll basically become an extension piece that will relocate the accelerator cable about 3 inches higher and hopefully fix the geometry. At least that's the plan. It's nighttime again already, but we've got a bracket. This is kind of what I came up with. So I'm using the stock bracket on the bottom. I made a little L bracket with the hole in the middle. That's for the stud that comes out of the stock bracket and the nut. I made sure to leave enough clearance for the washer and the nut. That comes up, and then I drilled a hole at the top of that one, and then a hole on another piece of plate, and then that one I had to go straight up where I welded the other piece that would normally be the stud on the bottom. I cut that off of my extra bracket, I put it up on top, and then I welded it together straight, and then I drilled another hole toward the bottom where I ran a bolt. After I did that, I installed it all straight, and then I ended up clocking this against the carburetor to make sure I had a straight shot for the accelerator cable, and I tested it and everything's good to go. I just need to remove a little bit of the tension from here, but for the most part everything's good to go. I already checked and I have full pedal operation, so we are actually good to go there. Once I decided on the position, I went ahead and I welded it and removed the bolt that was helping me clock it in the first place. Just welded it solid, and now it's good to go. This thing is super solid. It's not really going to be going anywhere. The force applied by the accelerator cable is not enough to bend 1/8 inch steel, so we are perfectly fine right there. The next order of business is to figure out what we're going to do with the kickdown. I think the easiest thing would probably be to install the shaft made for these types of transmission. It's a shaft that gets bolted up on this hole and then pulls out this way. Then I'm probably gonna have to cut it back here, extend it up, so that way I have a straight shot going that way, and it'll hopefully operate the exact same way. I'm gonna have a little bit of play for when I'm just cruising, and then I'm gonna set the backlash, so that way when I go into half throttle or full throttle, the transmission goes ahead and goes into kickdown mode, and I'll have full pressure at the valve body, so I don't have any roasted transmission. I've got the kickdown set up, I've got the throttle already set up. The kickdown, I just extended it and then bent the bar a little bit. It's not very beautiful. Later on I'm going to pick up some 5/8 flat bar and then actually make this look pretty good and have it avoid all of this linkage. But for right now, for what I need it for, it's going to be working fine. Edelbrock RPM intake is now successfully installed. I've already fixed up the situation with the mismatched gaskets. I don't have any leaks in the headers. Everything's all good there. I've already given it another once over, tightening everything down, so that's all good to go. I don't have any water leaks. The water pump housing is holding on well. My temperature gauge doesn't work, but it looks like I'm getting erratic readings from the wire that comes from the firewall, so I'm going to be replacing that. Maybe fix the temperature gauge, but for the most part, this thing's pretty much ready to go. The next step right now is to go get myself some tires, and I know just where I can get them. Well, this is starting to look like a parts car. Let's just go ahead and grab some of these bad boys to put them on the charger. You ready?